To protect the privacy of the individuals involved, certain names and identifying details within this account have been altered. Not all photographs shown are from the actual locations described. October 14, 2017, at 1540 hours, the location, a remote national forest near Mount Rose, Nevada. A group of hikers, seeking refuge from a sudden, violent storm, discovers an old logging cabin, a structure that appears on no topographic map. Inside, the air is still and heavy with an unnatural silence. Then, a sound. A dull, muffled knock coming from under the floorboards. After forcing a massive lock on a concealed hatch, they descend into a cold concrete cellar, where they are met with the thick stench of dampness and filth. In the far corner of the subterranean room, secured inside a rusted industrial cage, sits the figure of a woman, emaciated and frail. A heavy metal collar is clasped around her neck, attached to a thick chain that has been welded to a steel support beam. The woman is barely able to support her own weight, a skeletal 90 pounds, her skin a canvas of old scars and bruises. She is identified as 29-year-old Wanda Davis, a successful financial auditor who vanished from a motor yacht in Lake Tahoe's Emerald Bay on August 12, 2015, exactly 2 years and 2 months prior. For all that time, the entire nation had presumed her dead, her body lost forever to the lake's icy underwater currents. Law enforcement had long since closed her case, ruling it a tragic accident. The truth, however, was far more terrifying than a simple death. Who would entomb a living person in a forest bunker, dozens of miles from any sign of civilization? And what chilling secret had Wanda's closest companions tried to sink to the bottom of the lake? August 12, 2015, Lake Tahoe. A vast expanse of glacial water on the high mountain border between California and Nevada. The lake offered visitors an unusually warm and tranquil day. The afternoon air reached 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and the surface of the water was a perfect black mirror, untouched by even the slightest ripple. It was on this day that 27-year-old Wanda Davis, a highly accomplished financial auditor, embarked on a much-needed weekend escape from her demanding career. She was in the company of 3 other people: her fiancé, Mark Sterling, his business associate, David Vance, and the woman she considered her closest friend, Sarah Jenkins. Their destination was a luxurious rented motor yacht named the Silvercrest, a 65-foot vessel featuring 3 spacious cabins finished in dark wood. An entry in the port's official logbook confirms the timeline. The yacht departed the dock at 1430 hours. Its course set for Emerald Bay, one of the lake's most scenic and yet most treacherous locations. As late afternoon bled into evening, the sun dipping below the mountain peaks, the vessel dropped anchor 500 yards from the state park shoreline. The following 12 hours would become a complete void in the official record of this otherwise peaceful place. On August 13th, at 6:15 in the morning, a frantic radio transmission crackled over the Coast Guard's emergency channel. According to the official transcript, the distressed voice belonged to Mark Sterling. The man, his words broken by heavy, ragged breaths, reported that his fiancée had vanished from the boat without a trace. He claimed to have woken up around 6 a.m. to find her side of the bed empty. He said he had searched every cabin, the lavatory, and the main deck, but Wanda was gone. The only thing left behind was her favorite light jacket, lying on a leather sofa in the main cabin. At 700 hours, the first Coast Guard patrol boat arrived on the scene. 40 minutes later, a massive search and rescue operation was underway, an effort of a scale the county had not witnessed in over a decade. Lake Tahoe is a notoriously deceptive and dangerous body of water. Its depths can plunge to over 1,600 feet, and the water temperature in its lower regions remains a constant 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. For any person submerged in those conditions, the window for survival closes within minutes. Over 80 specialists from multiple agencies were mobilized for the search. 2 police helicopters with high-sensitivity thermal imagers systematically scanned a 15-mile radius of the water's surface. On the lake itself, 8 patrol boats crisscrossed the bay, while a team of 18 professional divers repeatedly descended into the icy blackness, pushing themselves to the absolute limits of human endurance. At that depth, the water becomes an opaque, greenish abyss with visibility reduced to less than 5 feet. Simultaneously, on land, more than 30 volunteers and canine units meticulously combed the dense forests of the state park, scrutinizing every trail and ravine on the off chance the missing woman had somehow managed to reach the shore. At 8:30 in the morning, Detectives from the local police department arrived on scene and immediately launched a full-scale criminal inquiry. In situations like this, the statistics are grimly predictable. The first to fall under suspicion are always those closest to the victim. On the pier, Mark, David, and Sarah were instantly separated from one another, forbidden from exchanging even a single glance before being escorted to different interview rooms at the Central Police Precinct. As they were being questioned, a team of forensic scientists, clad in sterile white suits, began their methodical work aboard the yacht, the Silverest. As darkness fell, the deck was bathed in the eerie chemical glow of luminol, a solution sprayed across cabin walls and metal railings in a desperate search for the faintest trace of scrubbed-away blood. They scrutinized every square inch of the wooden paneling under ultraviolet light, hunting for microscopic clothing, fibers, or the ghost of a struggle. Back at the station, the three witnesses were subjected to the same meticulous forensic examination as the boat. Medical examiners scoured their faces for scratch marks, their forearms for defensive bruises, their knuckles for damage, their clothes for tears, and their fingernails for breaks. They were looking for any sign pointing to a violent, desperate fight before a person went overboard, but the exhaustive search yielded absolutely nothing. There wasn't a single drop of foreign blood or DNA. Not one fingerprint in an unusual location. Not a broken nail, not a single scratch. And during hours of intense interrogation with the department's most seasoned detectives, the stories of the three friends aligned down to the most minute detail. Their official statements painted a clear, consistent picture. On the evening of August 12th, they had prepared dinner, shared 4 bottles of red wine, and retired to their cabins at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning. All 3 accounts were identical on this point. Wanda, they claimed, had had too much to drink, felt a wave of nausea, and likely went onto the deck slick from the evening fog for a breath of fresh air. A moonless, pitch-black night, a slippery, polished deck, low railings, and one single, unfortunate misstep. The frigid, heavy water had then silently claimed her. Investigators pored over the interrogation transcripts for hours on end, searching for any crack, any minute contradiction in the narratives they were given. To some detectives, the flawlessness of their stories was itself an alarm bell. The words sounded too smooth, too confident, as if they were lines from a script, carefully learned and rehearsed. David, in particular, presented a front of unsettling calm and composure, but with no body, no weapon, and not a shred of physical evidence. The police found themselves completely stonewalled. You cannot build a case on suspicion and a story that is, on the surface, perfect. And local law enforcement knew all too well the cruel nature of Lake Tahoe. It is a body of water infamous among recovery teams for its refusal to give up its dead. The water temperature, at its immense depths, is so profoundly cold that the biological processes of decomposition slow to a crawl, preventing the formation of gases that would otherwise lift a body to the surface. Victims can lie on the lake bed for years, preserved in an icy tomb, almost untouched by time. After several perilous dives, the search was called off on the 5th day. With no new leads and increasing risk to the dive teams, the active phase of the search was officially concluded. By the end of September 2015, the criminal case was formally closed. The chief investigator's final report was a sterile, standard legal conclusion: a tragic accident on the water. The 3 friends performed their parts of grieving, gathered their things, and quietly slipped back into their normal, comfortable lives in the city. The thin case file was relegated to an archive for unsolved incidents, where it began to collect a film of dust. On its face, the incident was a textbook tragedy, utterly transparent, just one among dozens of similar events that play out in national parks each year. Every detail appeared logical, flawless, and legally unimpeachable. Death had left no signature. But for the old-school detectives, men who had spent their careers navigating the currents of human deception, a heavy sense of doubt lingered. They couldn't know it then, but it was within that surgical precision of the testimony, in the complete and total absence of evidence, that the first, nearly invisible fracture was hidden. A fracture that would lie dormant, waiting for the right moment to splinter their peaceful world and unleash a true, concentrated evil that was, for now, breathing patiently in the total darkness. October 14th, 2017. The mountain range near the peak of Mount Rose in Nevada has always been notorious for its volatile weather. According to official records from that day, a group of 4 seasoned hikers was making a routine, planned descent. But around 2 p.m., the weather turned violently. A sudden squall unleashed gale-force winds reaching up to 50 miles per hour as the temperature plunged below 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Blinded by the whiteout conditions, the hikers became disoriented, wandering 3 miles west of the marked trail and into the depths of a dense, impenetrable coniferous forest. A desperate search for refuge from the driving, icy rain and brutal wind led a group of hikers to a profoundly unsettling discovery. It was the skeletal remains of a wooden structure consumed by rot. The building was swallowed by a deep ravine, obscured by a dense canopy of ancient trees that rendered it utterly invisible from above. Archives from the Bureau of Land Management later identified it as the long-forgotten Blackwood Ridge logging cabin, an outpost that had vanished from all topographical surveys for decades. Its collapsed roof was blanketed in a heavy coat of moss, and the window openings were sealed shut with massive, weathered planks. The structure seemed devoid of life, yet for the hypothermic tourists, it represented their only hope of surviving the blizzard. Forcing open the decaying front door, they stepped into an interior thick with the suffocating scent of decomposition. As the group huddled on the damp earth of the floor, battling the cold, one man abruptly motioned for quiet. Beneath the relentless howl of the storm, another sound had emerged, something entirely different. It was a low, muffled, yet unnervingly consistent thumping. The sound wasn't emanating from the walls or the leaking roof. It was coming from directly beneath the ground on which they sat. A careful inspection of the filthy wooden floorboards revealed the outline of an old, formidable hatch, masterfully concealed beneath years of compacted dirt and forest floor debris. A heavy, corroded padlock held it fast. Understanding that the sound was intelligent, not the scrabbling of an animal, the hikers used an ice axe to shatter the rusted locking mechanism. As the heavy lid screeched open, a wave of profound, tomb-like cold washed over them. An overpowering, concentrated odor of stagnant water, black mold, and human waste assaulted their senses. They activated their tactical flashlights and began a slow, deliberate descent down a set of steep concrete steps. Their beams sliced through the absolute black, illuminating a scene of unimaginable horror. Tucked into the farthest corner of the windowless cell was an industrial cage, crudely welded from thick steel rebar. And inside, slumped on a soiled mattress soaked through with moisture, was a figure that bore only a faint resemblance to a human. It was a woman, wasted away to a skeletal frame, weighing no more than 90 pounds. Her cheekbones were sharp promontories on a gaunt face, and her pallid skin was a roadmap of old lacerations and festering sores. The most chilling feature of this subterranean prison was the heavy metal collar cinched tightly around the captive's neck. A solid steel chain ran from the collar, its other end welded securely to a concrete support beam, restricting the victim. The woman shielded her eyes with filthy, trembling hands, overwhelmed by the sudden, painful glare of the flashlights. She was convulsing with terror, incapable of uttering a single sound. An official witness report states that one of the hikers moved toward the steel bars and gently asked for her name. With cracked, dehydrated lips, she breathed a nearly inaudible word. Wanda. Wanda Davis. This was the same Wanda Davis, a highly successful financial auditor who had vanished into the waters of Emerald Bay precisely 2 years and 2 months prior. For all that time, while the nation presumed her dead, she had been here, entombed in a forest bunker, cut off entirely from the known world. At 1740 hours, the hikers managed to transmit an emergency signal on their satellite phone. A specialized response team, comprising medics and special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was immediately dispatched to the coordinates. The extraction was conducted under a veil of extraordinary and unprecedented secrecy. Cloaked by the darkness of night and employing specialized hydraulic shears, the rescue team severed the thick chain from the woman's neck and carefully carried her to the surface on a stretcher. The recovery of Wanda Davis never reached the news cycle. There were no press briefings, no public announcements of any kind. By direct order from the regional head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the entire case was immediately classified. The emaciated victim was admitted under a pseudonym to a secure intensive care wing in Reno, where armed federal agents guarded the entire floor. The crime scene analysts who processed the Blackwood Ridge cellar understood one fact with absolute certainty. This concrete bunker had been meticulously designed as a soundproof chamber for inflicting torment, and whoever had engineered this nightmare had to be operating under the assumption that their victim was still locked away in the suffocating darkness. The site was intentionally left undisturbed, transforming the prison into an elaborate, high-stakes trap. Back in a sterile hospital room, detectives waited in a state of coiled tension for Wanda to regain consciousness and find her voice. Every passing minute was an eternity as they waited to finally learn the names of the individuals who had engineered her living hell. A living nightmare, completely unaware that the people she trusted most were predators hiding behind familiar masks. Before we delve deeper into the disturbing details of this investigation, we have a small request for our viewers. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to like and comment on the video. The platform's algorithms are designed so that your engagement helps our work reach a wider audience, allowing more people to see these investigations. We appreciate your support. Now, let's return to the case file. On October 17, 2017, an unmarked medical transport delivered a woman to the Regional Medical Center in Reno. To ensure the patient's absolute security, hospital administration cordoned off an entire wing of the 4th floor. At the heavy metal door of the intensive care unit, armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation stood watch around the clock. Physicians diagnosed the patient with profound physical exhaustion, an array of infections, and a critical vitamin deficiency born from a prolonged deprivation of sunlight. The medical team moved with deliberate quiet, knowing that the slightest unexpected sound sent their patient into a state of panic. It wasn't until the 5th day of intensive care, as intravenous fluids began to repair her body, that the woman known as Wanda could form more than just indecipherable, muffled sounds. Detective Chief Inspector Andrew Miller was granted clearance by her doctors for the first brief interview. The official report details the scene. The detective sat perfectly still by the hospital bed, capturing every weak, hoarse word on a handheld recorder. The fragmented testimony Wanda provided began to assemble itself into a coherent and deeply disturbing picture. It was a narrative of greed, desperation, and a chilling void of human empathy. The motive was stark and simple: a fortune built on blood money. Wanda's account began precisely 1 week before she disappeared. She was performing a routine financial audit for Apex Horizon Investments, a firm she believed was co-owned by her fiancé, Mark, and his business partner, David. As she dug deeper into the company's ledgers, the seasoned auditor unearthed a series of meticulously concealed transactions. Through a sophisticated web of shell corporations, her fiancé's company was funneling millions of dollars for one of Mexico's most ruthless drug cartels. Grasping the catastrophic reality of the crime, Wanda secured all the evidence onto an encrypted cloud drive, and that evening issued Mark an ultimatum. He was to report immediately to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and surrender himself to federal authorities. She told him if he refused, she would do it for him. With those words, she had unwittingly sealed her own fate. When a terrified Mark confessed the situation to David, his partner knew instantly that if the information leaked, the cartel's retaliation would be swift and merciless. David, always the cold strategist of their enterprise, seized control of the crisis, formulating a plan to neutralize the woman who threatened their existence. A murder aboard a luxury yacht was far too great a risk. David understood that forensic analysis would inevitably uncover microscopic traces of a struggle on the wooden deck, and there was always the chance a body could surface too soon. And so, on that fateful night, a massive dose of a powerful sedative was slipped, unnoticed, into Wanda's glass of red wine. As investigators learned from Wanda's testimony, the desolate Blackwood Ridge logging cabin was no random location. David had acquired the remote property through a labyrinth of shell companies long before the incident on the lake. Its concrete, soundproof basement had been prepared well in advance. The partners' initial plan was simple: hold the auditor captive, torture her for the encryption keys to the cloud drive, and then make her body disappear forever. But after Wanda broke and gave them the passwords, something inside David shifted. Intoxicated by the absolute power he held over another human being, a dormant, sadistic impulse surfaced. He decided to keep her, not as a prisoner, but as a slave. In the pitch-black silence of the forest bunker, a heavy steel collar and total isolation became his instruments for the methodical, multi-year dismantlement of her identity. While Wanda relayed her horrifying story from a secure hospital room, investigators knew the corroborating evidence they needed was buried in the digital past, a bloody trail hidden within every deleted byte of data they now had to find. The moment the chief investigator stepped out of that secure ICU, the trajectory of the entire criminal case was irrevocably altered. For 2 long years, What had been filed away as a tragic accident in the cold, dark waters of a mountain lake, now sharpened into the chilling outline of a meticulously executed conspiracy. The local detectives finally had the one thing they had been missing: a direction. The search for a body in the cold depths of Emerald Bay was over. The new quarry was far more elusive. The digital phantoms left behind by the crime's architects in August of 2015. In the modern age, a true disappearance is a myth. Every action leaves an indelible electronic echo. By the following morning, the case had officially escalated, drawing in the Cybercrime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Armed with the authority of a federal search warrant, special agents in their iconic windbreakers descended upon the Lake Tahoe headquarters of the luxury yacht charter service. Every piece of digital infrastructure, servers, hard drives, and entire backup arrays was systematically confiscated and transported to a secure forensic laboratory. The team's attention immediately converged on the navigation data from the yacht known as the Silvercrest, where an initial analysis of its onboard computer confirmed their deepest fears. The primary log from the global positioning system had been wiped. An individual with an intimate and sophisticated knowledge of marine electronics had methodically erased all records of the vessel's journey on that critical night, overwriting the memory sectors with a clean slate of zeros. It was this flawless digital void that had initially led investigators to the false conclusion that the yacht had never left its mooring. But the perpetrators had overlooked a single critical detail: a covert security protocol on modern luxury vessels, installed for the benefit of insurance carriers. This system functions entirely on its own, transmitting telemetry data to a remote cloud server every hour via a separate, redundant satellite link. It required nearly 48 hours of relentless work for the Bureau's cyber unit to breach the provider company's encrypted archive. When the decoded coordinates finally materialized on the large monitors of the command center, a profound, heavy silence settled over the room. Before them, the investigators watched the architecture of a nightmare unfold. According to the recovered electronic trail, at precisely 2:30 in the morning, the yacht had slipped its anchor, its engines running at their lowest possible speed to muffle any sound. The massive vessel glided out of Emerald Bay, commencing a silent, ghostly voyage across the lake. It moved through absolute darkness, slicing through frigid, ink-black water that plummeted to depths of over 1,000 feet. Telemetry sensors recorded the vessel's path as it approached a desolate, abandoned pier near the community of Zephyr Cove on the Nevada side of the lake. The location was perfectly secluded, shrouded by dense evergreen forests and entirely devoid of any artificial light. The yacht remained moored at the pier for exactly 20 minutes. It was within this narrow window of time that Wanda, rendered helpless and sedated by powerful tranquilizers, was moved from her cabin, hauled across the slick deck, and loaded into a waiting vehicle. Afterward, the yacht retraced its path with the same stealth, creating the perfect illusion of a tranquil, undisturbed night. Armed with a precise time and location, detectives made contact with the Nevada Department of Transportation. They put in a request for terabytes of surveillance records from traffic cameras positioned along State Route 28. Dozens of analysts maintained around-the-clock vigil, their eyes scanning grainy, monochromatic screens for any trace of movement on the deserted nocturnal roads. At long last, the painstaking work yielded a result. At 3:45 in the morning, an infrared camera near an interchange captured the image of a vehicle. It was a dark blue pickup truck, moving at high speed through the dense night fog. While its license plates had been deliberately obscured with a thick layer of mud, automotive forensic specialists quickly identified the make, model, and specific modifications of the truck. Every one of these characteristics was a perfect match for the vehicle registered to David Vance. The network of cameras tracked the pickup's journey all the way to the turnoff for the Mount Rose Highway, the same mountain pass that led directly into impenetrable forest and toward a derelict logging cabin. The chain of digital evidence was seamless, irrefutable. A web of computer systems, satellites, and traffic cameras had coldly and without bias chronicled the kidnappers' every move: the route, the timeline, the vehicle. Each piece of data was another thread woven into a single, tightening noose that was closing around the perpetrators' necks. Yet, the most seasoned investigators understood a bitter truth: that a team of expensive lawyers could cast doubt on any electronic record in court, painting it as a technical failure or an outright fabrication. To guarantee that these monsters would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, the investigation needed the human element. They needed an ironclad confession from someone who had been on that yacht, They needed the person whose mind was poisoned by fear and whose conscience had been slowly corroding from within for 2 long years. Model. As dawn approached, their target was clear. The cyber unit had assembled a flawless digital case. But seasoned investigators understood a grim reality of the justice system. High-priced attorneys could easily spin satellite coordinates and telemetry data into nothing more than a computer glitch. To ensure the perpetrators would never walk free, the prosecution was missing its most critical component, a human voice. Investigators required an insider's account, a statement from someone who was on the yacht's polished deck on that fateful night. After a thorough analysis of the suspect's psychological profiles, detectives pinpointed the one fragile link in the chain of silence, an old friend of Wanda's named Sarah Jenkins. On October 21, 2017, at 10 in the morning, Sarah Jenkins received an official invitation to the Central Police Station. The pretext offered by investigators was designed to be as innocuous as possible. They explained over the phone it was a mere formality, a few signatures needed on archival documents for a long-closed case. The strategy was a success. Sarah arrived at the station, appearing completely at ease, a paper coffee cup in her hand. In the 2 years that had passed, she had constructed a reality where the horror was buried, and she was safe from its reach. She was escorted to an interview room on the 2nd floor, a tight, windowless space that felt claustrophobic. Inside, the aggressive air conditioning kept the temperature at a brisk 65 degrees Fahrenheit, while a fluorescent light hummed a monotonous drone from above. Sarah took a seat at the heavy metal desk, settling into the unforgiving chair. She anticipated stacks of old, yellowed files, but when Detective Andrew Miller entered, his hands were empty. There were no folders, no documents, not even a recording device. Miller sat opposite her in silence, allowing a long moment to pass. The weight of the silence grew heavier, with each second before he slowly reached into his jacket pocket, retrieving a single object and placing it face up on the table. It was a recent 8x10 photograph, taken just days earlier inside a secure hospital ward. The image was of a woman staring directly into the camera, her eyes vacant and hollow. Weighing no more than 90 pounds, her face was a gaunt mask. Her skin bore the deep, pitted scars of infection, and across her thin, emaciated neck, the terrible crimson welts were impossible to miss. They were the marks left by a heavy metal collar she had been forced to wear for over 2 years. According to the official log from the observation room, Sarah's reaction was both immediate and catastrophic. The paper cup slipped from her trembling hand, its hot contents spilling across the cold metal of the table. She began to gasp for air, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as uncontrollable hysteria set in, showing all the signs of a massive panic attack. The sudden, shocking realization that Wanda was alive, that she had escaped that concrete hell and revealed everything to the authorities, shattered Sarah's carefully constructed psychological defenses. The terror she had suppressed for 2 years erupted with unstoppable force. She fractured completely, beginning to talk before Detective Miller even had a chance to read her Miranda rights. Speaking through a torrent of uncontrollable sobs, Sarah delivered a detailed confession that the stenographer struggled to keep up with. She explained that on a night in August of 2015, she was woken around 2 a.m. by a strange, heavy dragging sound coming from just beyond her cabin. When she stepped from her cabin into the dimly lit corridor, she was paralyzed by what she saw. Just a few feet in front of her, Mark and David were hauling the limp, lifeless body of Wanda toward the deck's railing. David's eyes locked onto her instantly. According to Sarah's account, he closed the distance between them in a flash. His gaze was cold, devoid of all emotion. He pressed the heavy blade of a hunting knife to the pulse in her throat, applying enough pressure to draw a single bead of blood. Leaning in, his face inches from hers, David whispered his ultimatum. If she ever spoke a word, if she failed to confirm the official story of an accidental fall overboard, her elderly parents, living alone in a quiet suburb just 30 miles away, would experience an agony slower and more terrible than she could possibly conceive. With the cold steel against her skin, Sarah made her decision. For the next 2 years, she existed in a state of paralyzing, animalistic fear, transforming from a best friend into a silent accomplice to an unthinkable crime. The transcript of her confession ran over 30 pages. Every word she uttered was another nail in the coffin of the perpetrators. The investigation now had everything it needed: the digital forensics, the travel routes, the motive, and now the eyewitness account. The trap was set. All that remained was to compel the deception's chief architect, the man who had flawlessly performed the role of the grieving husband, to walk willingly into the heart of a psychological snare he never knew had been set. On October 22, 2017, a mere 24 hours after Sarah Jenkins had signed her confession, detectives initiated the final stage of their calculated operation. They already possessed a mountain of evidence, but the lead investigator, Andrew Miller, demanded something more. He needed to witness the impeccable facade, the mask that had concealed these ruthless monsters for years, finally shatter. The next person in Justice's sights was Mark Sterling, Wanda's former fiancé. The police had laid a trap for him that was nothing short of perfect, skillfully designed to prey upon his profound sense of invulnerability and his overweening confidence. Mark was called to the Central Police Department under a familiar, deceptively harmless pretext: the formal closure of minor procedural matters in a case long since archived. The man entered the police station at 2:15 in the afternoon. According to the officers on duty, his demeanor was one of supreme calm and arrogance. He was dressed in an expensive navy blue business suit, his face set in the well-rehearsed mask of a man broken by grief, unable to move past the tragic loss of a loved one. He was convinced that he held absolute control over the situation, that he was the one manipulating the investigation. He had no idea that an entire team of federal agents was already waiting for him, watching him passively from behind a two-way mirror of the interrogation room. He was escorted into the same claustrophobic, soundproofed, and windowless room where Sarah's resolve had crumbled just one day earlier. Detective Miller entered after him, but this time he carried no printed photographs or thick case files. His hands held a single, small object, a digital voice recorder. This simple black plastic device was intended to be the key that would unlock a horrifying truth. Miller took a seat in silence at the heavy metal table, directly across from his suspect. Mark was the first to speak, attempting a tired, pained smile as he asked how much more of the endless paperwork he needed to sign. But the veteran investigator offered no reply. He simply held Mark's gaze with a hard, cold stare, allowing the quiet in the room to become a palpable, unbearable weight. Miller then slowly lifted his hand, placed the recorder on the table between them, and decisively pressed the play button. A faint hiss of static emerged from the small speaker, followed by a voice faint, broken, but utterly and unmistakably female. The recording, according to the official transcript, was a segment of the previous day's interview from the hospital's intensive care unit. It was the voice of Wanda, the woman Mark himself had condemned to a living grave, articulating each sound with chilling precision. Mark was standing right beside me as David secured that cold metal around my neck. Mark just leaned down, kissed my forehead, and whispered, "I'm sorry, honey, but this is just business." The audio clip ran for less than 15 seconds, but its psychological impact was equivalent to a direct artillery strike. Surveillance cameras captured, frame by excruciating frame, the instantaneous destruction of the illusion of control Mark had so carefully maintained for over 2 years. The color drained from his face, his skin turning a ghastly, parchment-like white. His eyes flew wide with a raw, uncontrollable animal terror. The only thing that emerged from his dry throat was a hoarse, choking sound, like a death rattle. The man's hands clamped onto the edge of the metal table with such force that his knuckles blanched white. The woman he was certain was buried forever beneath tons of concrete and forest soil had just spoken to him from beyond the grave, pulling his entire world down into ruin. Panic seized his mind, swift and absolute. With the realization that Wanda was alive and that investigators now knew every horrific detail of their plan, Mark lost all remaining fragments of his composure. The vision of spending the rest of his life inside a concrete box in a maximum security prison completely annihilated his inflated ego. In a desperate, primal bid to save himself from a life sentence, he began to talk hysterically, incoherently, and unstoppably implicating his business partner. Mark shrieked that David Vance was a true clinical psychopath, that this entire diabolical scheme was Vance's creation, and that Vance had forced him to take part in the kidnapping at gunpoint. From his trembling lips came a torrent of the gruesome, sickeningly cynical details of their crime. In his official statement, Mark corroborated the framework of what investigators already suspected, but he then began to add a new layer of chilling, logistical horror to the narrative. His testimony painted a clear picture. David had assumed complete and solitary control of Wanda's captivity inside a soundproof bunker near Mount Rose. He recounted for investigators in meticulous detail, how David would climb into his pickup truck every couple of weeks for a long drive over miles of desolate mountain terrain. With a look of profound dread, Mark confessed that David wasn't providing his prisoner with actual human food. He would purchase the most inexpensive dry dog kibble he could find in massive 50-pound bags, which he would unceremoniously dump into the dark cellar along with some jugs of processed water. This was the treatment reserved for a once thriving professional, something less than what one would offer a stray animal. Detective Miller absorbed the sickening confession, recognizing the desperate words of a coward trying to trade betrayal for a more lenient sentence. The investigator knew, with cold certainty, that they now possessed every last piece of this grim and bloody puzzle. They finally had a solid case against the primary architect of this suffering. But then, lost in his torrent of self-preservation, Mark recalled another vital piece of information. David Vance was always heavily armed, profoundly cunning, and pathologically paranoid. The window of opportunity was closing, and tactical units were already moving, silently boarding heavy armored transport vehicles. They were preparing to make a call on the most dangerous person of interest in the investigation. While Mark Sterling sputtered through his story in the claustrophobic, windowless interview room at police headquarters, pathetically attempting to negotiate for his own future, the gears of justice had already begun their inexorable turn. Detective Andrew Miller wasn't merely letting the suspect talk to kill time. Each minute that Mark spent on his shameful confession bought the Special Operations team more precious time to get into position. The mission to apprehend the mastermind behind this vicious crime was being orchestrated with extreme precision. The Woe Valley, a stretch of land nestled between Reno and Carson City, was known for its sprawling estates, where the affluent shielded their private lives behind towering fences and thick stands of trees. David Vance's residence was a perfect monument to this culture of elite seclusion. It was a sprawling structure of over 8,000 square feet, constructed in a cold, minimalist style of concrete and smoked glass. A high wall, capped with a wrought iron gate, surrounded the mansion, which was bristling with a sophisticated video surveillance network. David had always craved absolute dominion over his environment, but on this particular evening, his fortress of security would prove utterly worthless. At 1645 hours, 3 hulking armored tactical vans, running dark with no sirens or emergency lights, glided to a halt at the property's main entrance. The operators, clad in heavy Kevlar and armed with assault-grade weaponry, moved with the clean precision of surgeons. In a matter of seconds, a hydraulic tool sheared through the forged gate mechanism. The entry team moved like shadows across the manicured lawn, establishing positions around the massive oak front door. The breach was an explosion of controlled violence. A heavy tactical ram obliterated the door from its frame, reducing the solid wood to a cloud of splinters. Flashbang grenades arced through the air, landing deep inside the cavernous marble foyer. Blinding flashes and deafening reports tore apart the sterile silence of the opulent home. A wave of special forces operators poured inside, systematically and relentlessly clearing the residence floor by floor. Clear, clear. The clipped, unemotional commands echoed from various points within the vast mansion. They located David Vance on the second floor, inside his expansive private study. He was found sitting behind an antique mahogany desk in a large leather chair, without enough time to even stand. This architect of agony, a man who had reveled in his absolute power over a helpless victim in a forest bunker for years, presented no fight at all. He was forced down, his face pressed against the expensive Italian parquet flooring. His arms were wrenched behind his back, and the cold steel of handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. According to the tactical commander's subsequent report, the most unnerving detail of the entire encounter was the look in Vance's eyes. There was no fear, no shock, and not a flicker of remorse in his gaze. It was a look of complete clinical void, the hollow stare of a predator who had just accepted that his hunt had concluded. The moment the suspect was escorted from the property and secured in an armored vehicle, a team of forensic specialists began their work. Investigators initiated a methodical, grid-by-grid search of every room, with Vance's office designated as the primary point of interest. As one of the detectives was tapping along the dark oak-paneled walls, he detected a hidden void. Concealed behind a large painting, they discovered a modern, fire-resistant safe secured with a complex electronic keypad. With David's steadfast refusal to cooperate, authorities brought in a specialist in forensic locksmithing. The painstaking process of breaching the lock took nearly 3 hours. but what lay inside shattered every preconceived notion the investigators had. The safe held no mountains of currency. Instead, meticulously arranged on the steel shelving were several encrypted flash drives. The FBI Cybercrimes Unit would later confirm their contents. These digital devices held the complete, unedited financial ledgers of a Mexican drug cartel. They were the same files that had stolen 2 years of Wanda Davis's life. Yet, it wasn't the financial data that left the investigators cold. Alongside the digital evidence were items that held an entirely different, more perverse kind of value for Vance. These were his trophies. Inside a small velvet box, detectives discovered a gold and diamond ring, the one Mark had placed on Wanda's finger the day they got engaged. David had kept it, a symbol of his absolute victory over the fate of others. Next to the box lay a heavy, crude bundle of old keys. They were a stark, unsettling contrast to the opulence of the mansion and the fire of the diamond. Detective Miller, having arrived at the scene, used a pair of metal tongs to carefully lift the keys, sealing them within a clear plastic evidence bag. His focus narrowed on the largest key in the bunch. Even to the naked eye, dark brownish flecks were visible on its jagged metal teeth. Forensic analysis in the lab would soon confirm his darkest suspicions. The spots were a combination of microscopic rust particles and Wanda's dried blood. It was the key to the massive padlock that had secured the rusty cage in the derelict Blackwood Ridge logging cabin. With such overwhelming physical proof, the perpetrators were remanded to solitary confinement, denied any possibility of bail. The legal trap had snapped shut, the case seemingly closed. But for this story to find its true conclusion, the woman who had survived 2 years of abject darkness still had to speak. It wasn't until October 25, 2017, when the heavy steel doors of the isolation cells slammed shut behind each of the defendants, and the district court issued its final, irrevocable denial of bail, that federal authorities at last lifted the case's top-secret classification. Until that moment, every detail of the operation had been shrouded in secrecy, hidden behind layers of terse, bureaucratic denials. The press conference held the following morning in the main hall of the Reno Police Headquarters landed with the force of a detonation. The story of Wanda Davis instantly became a national firestorm, obliterating all other news from the front pages. The country reeled, not just from the unimaginable, calculated cruelty of the crime itself, but from the chilling reality that these ruthless monsters were the people closest to the victim, her own fiancé and her trusted friends. For days, news helicopters orbited David Vance's sprawling mansion in the Washoe Valley, their cameras capturing agents removing box after box of financial records. Journalists in rugged SUVs swarmed the police cordons at Mount Rose, desperate for a shot of the remote wooden cabin. Reporters laid siege to the local medical center, hoping for any scrap of information about the rescued woman's condition. But law enforcement erected an impenetrable wall of protection around Wanda, granting her the space to begin the grueling process of physical and psychological recovery. She had to learn again how to exist in the daylight, how not to be sent into a panic by a sudden noise, how to navigate the terror of her nightmares, and how to embrace open spaces not defined by bars of rust. The trial, which commenced in the spring of 2018, would become one of the most significant and large-scale prosecutions in the criminal history of Nevada. A high-priced legal team hired by the defense attempted to exploit procedural weaknesses, but their efforts were systematically crushed by the monolithic weight of the evidence. The district prosecutor constructed a case that was nothing short of an impenetrable fortress. Before the jury, the entire anatomy of the conspiracy was laid bare, piece by painstaking piece. Cyber specialists presented decrypted navigation data from the Silvercrest yacht and displayed cellular billing records across massive screens in the hushed courtroom. They played grainy footage from a traffic camera, showing a pickup truck tearing through a dense night fog. The most damning elements, however, were the physical evidence and the human testimony. Detective Andrew Miller stood before the jury and personally presented the very same bundle of old keys recovered from David's hidden safe. A forensic expert then confirmed the presence of trace amounts of rust and a definitive DNA match to Wanda on the metal. And then, a shattered Sarah Jenkins took the witness stand. With a voice choked by sobs, she recounted under oath the story of the icy steel at her neck and the paralyzing threats that had enforced her silence for 2 years. Her words shattered the defendant's carefully constructed facade of innocence. The weight of her testimony became too much for Mark Sterling to bear. In a desperate mid-trial maneuver, he attempted to negotiate with investigators, an effort met with an immediate and firm rejection from the prosecutor's office. This case offered no room for leniency. The trial reached its inevitable climax with the announcement of the verdict. A profound stillness settled over the courtroom that day. David Vance remained a statue at the defense table, his gaze flat and predatory, a mask of chilling indifference. Mark Sterling, in stark contrast, was visibly disintegrating. He wrung his trembling hands, his face a sallow gray from the sleepless nights now consumed by the crushing certainty of his fate. Yet, the focus of the dozens of people gathered in that room was not on either of the condemned men. Wanda Davis was making her first public appearance in front of the media's lenses since her ordeal began. She was a world away from the emaciated, 90-pound captive who had been rescued from that basement, though a high silk scarf artfully hid the brutal crimson scars left by a metal collar. And while a subtle unsteadiness lingered in her walk, she projected an astonishing and unbreakable inner fortitude. Wanda required no prepared statement. Words were entirely superfluous. She simply moved with quiet deliberation to the front row, her gaze locking on to the two individuals who had erased hundreds of days of her life. In that unwavering, penetrating stare lay her final victory, a silent declaration that they had failed to break her spirit. The judge delivered the sentence, his voice steady and clinical, but each syllable struck the silence like a hammer blow. For charges ranging from kidnapping and aggravated false imprisonment to systematic torture and money laundering, David Vance and Mark Sterling each received 2 consecutive life sentences, with no possibility of parole. Their new home would be a maximum security federal prison located in Colorado. There, they are to spend 23 hours a day inside solitary concrete cells, condemned to the same profound isolation they had forced upon Wanda. For her role in the conspiracy and its concealment, Sarah Jenkins was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Following the legal proceedings, heavy excavators descended on the old Blackwood Ridge cabin and razed it to the ground. The deep concrete bunker beneath was then filled completely with tons of gravel and cement, obliterating the hideous landmark of cruelty forever. A saga that was born in the frigid, dark currents of Lake Tahoe and spiraled into the pitch-black hell of a secluded forest prison had culminated in an absolute triumph for justice. Lake Tahoe would go on guarding its timeless secrets beneath its chilling, deep waters. But now, its most sinister secret had finally been wrestled from its grasp, exposed by the power of the human will. Beneath the polished surface of our everyday lives, shadows often breathe in the silence. The harrowing ordeal of Wanda Davis serves as a haunting reminder that evil rarely wears a monstrous mask. It often wears the face of the person holding your hand. We walk through the world assuming safety in the familiar. Yet Wanda's story teaches us that the ultimate betrayal doesn't always come from a stranger in the dark. It can come from a fiancé's kiss or a best friend's smile. It reminds us that vigilance is not a sign of fear, but the guardian of our lives. We must trust our intuition. When a story feels too perfect or a silence feels too heavy, we must have the courage to look deeper. However, her survival is also a magnificent testament to the unbreakable human spirit. 2 years of absolute darkness, isolation, and cruelty could not extinguish her will to exist. Her story proves that even when the world presumes us lost, our inner light remains a beacon that can never be truly entombed. Let this be our call to action. Never turn a blind eye to the shadows. Be the person who stops to listen to the muffled knock beneath the floorboards. In a world where predators hide behind masks of normalcy, let our empathy be our shield, and our voices be the keys that unlock the cages of the forgotten. Justice is not just a verdict. It is the refusal to let the truth stay buried.